my philosophy always was take care of the cask, and the cask will take care of the patrons.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never had anybody tell me that wasn't what we were doing.
Agreed.
Bienvenue. Welcome to Coffee Talk with King Francois I, where we will discover the tales, trials, and talents of Renaissance Festival performers, merchants, and die-hard attendees as we journey by way of light-hearted and even at times heartwarming conversations about the Renaissance Festival world. I am your host, Theodore Jander, aka King Francois I. Bonjour. Welcome to Coffee Talk with King Francois I, episode 31. I am your host, Theodore Jander. In this Coffee Talk, you will partake in my conversation with Douglas Carr, a longtime friend and former creative director of the St. Louis Renaissance Festival. Editing the near 3 hours of audio and preparing the content for this episode was an absolute pleasure. I say this because the 2024 season of the St. Louis Renaissance Festival has started with me in the still new role of cast director. And the insight Douglas shared, along with some very humbling and enlightening discussions, could not have been better timed to revisit. I am quite excited to share this episode with each of you. A side note, as I mentioned, the original length of the conversation between Douglas and me lasted nearly 3 hours, so I am splitting it up between 2 episodes. Before jumping into the first half of our conversation, some more coffee humor to start things brewing. This one goes out to all you Star Wars fans. To whom did Han Solo owe coffee? If you guessed Jabba the Hutt, you are correct. I will say, though, I think that joke probably missed the mark with some of you, kind of like the stormtroopers. With that bit of brew-licious humor, grab a cup of your favorite Java, sit back, and enjoy this episode of Coffee Talk with King Francois I and my guest and friend, Douglas Carr.
It is my pleasure to welcome Douglas Carr to the Coffee Talk with King Francois I podcast. Well met to you, Douglas.
Well met. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. As coffee is part of this podcast, I do like to start off with a few questions about coffee before we move into our conversation about all things Renaissance Festival. So, Douglas, to begin, if you are a coffee drinker, how do you take your coffee, and do you have a favorite roast?
Oh, yes. Well, give it to me as dark as you can give. I like the bitterest of coffees, but I also like it cold brewed.
Oh, okay.
That's where I'm at, especially in weather like this.
Yes, when it's really hot, that hot coffee is not necessarily a good thing. I've had some really good cold brew from Scooters.
Okay.
That I had never been up until a couple months ago. I went and I had bought a cold brew and it's like, this is the best cold brew because I didn't have anything in it. I didn't have sugar. Oh, yeah, it was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Give me a dark roast. Yeah.
Okay.
But I like my spoon to stand up in it.
Okay. Nice. Sweet. All right. So tell us about your favorite coffee shop. Where is it located and what makes it your favorite coffee shop? What do you like about it?
Well, there used to be a coffee shop in a back alley in a place called Claremont Village. It was built in the back room of a store.
Okay.
But the coffee shop itself was like, as I said, it was like in a back room in an alley. nowhere where you would normally think yourself that you would be at night. And for the life of me, I cannot remember their name, but that's good, I guess, because they don't exist anymore. But many a night spent in there drinking sludge. Yeah, great place.
Sweet. What about it was attractive?
It was so this was at the beginning of Starbucks moving into Southern California.
Okay.
And it was so opposite of that. I'll be honest, I go to Starbucks. It's convenient.
Right.
I think they sell a decent product. But this place was so anti-Starbucks. It was, the floors were a little dirty. They played music that you didn't hear on the radio. The atmosphere was like you might see in an old Mickey Spillane novel.
Okay.
And it was just the place. I mean, because we all thought we were going to change the world anyway, right? That we were
right. Yeah.
Going to teach everyone not to be consumers and whatever else. And so it was just the place to be.
Okay. Sweet. If you could have coffee potentially in such a place as that with any historical figure, who would you choose and why?
I think this is kind of a giveaway. If you know anything about me, it would be William Shakespeare. I don't know if I need to really explain the why, but I have been a fan of Shakespearean writing like since I first read it in high school.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't surprise me.
I'd love to pick his brain.
Yeah.
Because the thing to me is so many people think of Shakespeare as so high and official and lordly. And of course, there might be some of that. But frankly, Shakespeare wrote trashy stories. And I loved it. I love it. I still love it.
Yeah.
And I wonder if he would be surprised at the reverence he's often paid by people who I suspect don't really understand Shakespeare.
Yeah, I could see that. There was someone I met doing a production at, what used to be the St. Louis School of Pharmacy. It's now the University of Health Sciences and something. Anyway, they were looking for a few more people to fill in some spots and was asked to participate. And I was like, I haven't been on a theater stage in a long time. I was like, why not? They were saying here, there'll only be a few lines. Well, I had an absolute blast. It was really a lot of fun. And it was about the reign of Queen Elizabeth. And it was a back and forth between the elder Elizabeth and the younger Elizabeth. When I first started looking at the script and a couple of the first rehearsals, I was trying to figure out what was going on because there was a lot of this back and forth. But it really turned out to be a fun experience. And it was really a neat way to look at her from that perspective. Anyway, one of the gentlemen that was on the cast, I believe was he doing some kind of work on Shakespeare, but had no theater experience.
Okay.
Which kind of blew my mind because I would think somebody with theater experience would have more of an interest in Shakespeare than somebody not. But I think that's actually also a cool thing that somebody who doesn't have that background, who has such a vested interest in Shakespeare or in theater, to do that kind of a research. So
absolutely.
William Shakespeare is a pretty good segue into the Renaissance because you can't probably go to a Renaissance festival and not find something William Shakespeare. Yeah. Especially on the stage. So, what is your favorite Renaissance word and why?
Okay. So I had a lot of thought about this. And to be honest with you, and the reason why will probably come right back. My favorite Renaissance word is bunghole. And the reason why is because we probably got our biggest laughs on stage when we did our Green Eggs and Hamlet with the word bunghole. So,
is that really a Renaissance word? Like from the era?
Well, it's from the era. It was used in Hamlet.
Oh, really?
It is included in Shakespeare's play. In his terms, they were using it either, I would say probably before his time, a bunghole being a hole in a cask through which you would drain or introduce a liquid of some kind.
Oh.
Bungholes have probably existed as long as casks have, because a bung would go into the hole. It's a stopper, would stop it.
Oh, well, thank you for providing that definition, because that is not
right.
that is not what I thought of. And as I would imagine, a great deal of my listeners probably the same thing. And for me, the image that jumps into my mind is Beavis and Butthead.
Of course.
So
imagine a Shakespearean Beavis and Butthead. Yeah. Which, of course, is why I had so much fun screaming bunghole on stage.
Oh, my gosh. That's brilliant. Oh, wow. When I interviewed Josh Jennings with Pirates Inc., his favorite word was feck.
Okay.
F-E-C-K, and it means useful or use. Right. So to be feckless is to be useless, and feckful is to be useful.
Everybody wants to be a good feck.
Yes, yeah. Oh, yeah. It's kind of sad that there are a lot of these words that aren't used anymore, because there's so much almost practicality to it. Like, it makes sense, like bunghole. Bung is a stopper, and you're putting something into a bunghole. You're putting something into that hole. Oh, it's like on my computer, the little bitty USB thing to use a wireless mouse. That little thing, it's called a dongle.
Right.
I'd be curious to the etymology of that word. Like, where did dongle come from?
So does that make the slot that it slides in a dongle hole?
Dongle hole? Oh, that can go so many different directions, I'm sure. So I am somewhat aware of your history with Renaissance festivals. I know that you've been involved for quite a long time. Tell my listeners and myself the story about how you fell in love with Renaissance festivals.
Wow. Okay, so to tell this story, we have to go back a few years.
That's okay.
My family had gone to, so I'm originally from Southern California, and members of my family had frequented the Southern California Pleasure Fair several times. And to be honest with you, every time they invited me to go, I couldn't see any reason to. Why do I want to go hang out with a bunch of people who dress up like that? And seriously, for most of my young adult life, I didn't go. And then in 1990, I had a particularly rocky period of time in my life. And a friend of mine came to me and he said, I know what you need. He said, I'm doing this thing at the Renaissance Fair. You need to come out and do it with me. I said, why not? Okay. And so what he was doing was he was part of the fencing school there. And I came out and learned how to fence and worked at the fencing school with him. And it was magical to be a part of the show. Like, from the first day of actually being there, I could see how wrong I was for years, that I should have gone. I should have been a part of this. I should have taken every opportunity to go whenever I was invited. And from that day on, it's like there's a chord in me that is tuned to Renaissance Fair, and it vibrates when the Renaissance Fair is around, and it just makes me want to be a part. So that's how it started.
Oh, cool. You allude to that energy that comes out of the Renaissance Festival, and that chord that's in you, that it's something that we as participants feed off of in a lot of ways, that draw us to that. And you jumped right in. You didn't start off by attending a Renaissance Festival because, as you said, you had been invited, your family had gone, but you chose, nah, it's not for me. you were invited to participate as a type of performer, essentially.
Well, as a worker, really.
Yeah.
It was a job.
Yeah. But it took off. You loved that.
Yeah. Couldn't get enough.
Yeah.
When I first started working there, I was also tending bar at a restaurant not too far away. And I would get off work midnight, Friday night, rush home, grab my stuff, drive out to the fair site. A buddy of mine would put up a tent and I'd spend the night there. I'd get up, I'd work all morning till about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Then I would run home, change back into bar uniform, go back and tend bar, get off work at 2, drive right back out to the fair in the middle of the night, crash, and then get up the next morning and work all day Sunday. I lived for it.
Wow. How long did you do the whole, I'm going to go out and crash on the weekends while I'm out there in the tent and get up and work? And
almost 10 years. Within 2 years, I became the manager of the fencing school.
Oh, nice.
Which was great. I mean, and it actually meant that I was there even longer. And then about 7 years in, I made the transition from working at the fencing school to being a part of a stage show. I wrote and directed that. And then I went from there to actually being a stage manager for the fair itself.
Oh.
Full time. I was working at that bar. It was a good job because I could manage the hours and still have time to do the shows.
Oh, nice. I would think that having that freedom, you're able to work during the week and even into the weekends and on the weekends. And if you didn't, how far away did you live from the festival?
About 10, 12 miles, not too far.
Oh, that's not bad at all. Oh my gosh.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And how easy that would be then to jump in and be able to do that. So for all intents and purposes, you've been performing or part of the behind the scenes, the front of the scenes, entertainment, etc. side of things since 1990?
About, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's been a few years this last decade, right?
Right.
But yeah, it covered 3 decades.
Okay. So did any of your education, whether it was grade school, high school, etc., any jobs that you have play a part in your involvement with Renaissance festivals?
I think so. Some of it not necessarily directly. I'll tell you what I mean. So first, I'm a history major, a history student. I'm a history teacher.
Okay.
My pre-service degree is in history. I'm a teacher, but my degree isn't in education. It's in history.
Okay.
And so that's always been a love. So the history part of the Renaissance Fair has always attracted me. And while I was getting involved in the fair at first, I was attending classes at Cal State San Bernardino, which was 2 miles away from the fair site. So on a lot of those Fridays before fair, I'd get out of class, go out to the fair site and help set up the campsite before I'd go back then and, work at the bar.
Oh, okay.
So there's that, but there's also being a bartender. You get used to talking to people.
Mm-hmm.
And on different levels. It's not necessarily just asking what somebody would like to order. It's holding conversations. It's telling jokes and telling stories. It's listening to people. And these are all skills that I'd like to say I put to good use while I've been out at various fairs. As a performer, you have to be able to talk to people.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to listen to people, and you have to be able to, I saw being a bartender was part performance. I see part of being a teacher, part of it is performing.
Absolutely.
So to me, it's all related. Yeah. I think that my teaching, my bartending, my ability to talk to people I don't know has helped me out a lot. When I worked with people who were new to the fair, one of the big things many of them had to get over was a fear of talking to people they didn't know. And yeah, I think it's a big part of it.
Yeah. So on the flip side, your job's impacting your involvement in Renaissance festivals. Have Renaissance festivals or has your several decades of involvement benefited your job outside of the Ren Fair world? I would imagine so more now.
I think so. I think so too. So what I was able to achieve with the St. Louis Renaissance Fair was it was a dream. It was amazing. It was more than I ever thought I would achieve. We used to sit at the Southern California Fair. We used to sit and watch the big parades go by. And when you're working for a booth, even the fencing school, which was like one of the biggest draws as far as booths go, when you're just a boothie, you sit and you watch the big players go by.
Mm-hmm.
There's a veil between you and them. There's a magical screen where all the decisions happen, where all the creativity begins. And I got to cross beyond that. Now, honestly, I don't know if our magical screen was that mysterious at St. Louis Renaissance Fair, but I got to step through that veil and I got to be a part of the lifeblood of the fair. I got to be a part of the actual life of what we did.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, I never thought that it was a dream that I could be on that level somewhere. And I achieved it. I didn't expect it. I wasn't necessarily working toward it. And the next thing I knew, I was there.
Right.
I think that has helped me in my occupation to be a little more self-assured, to be a little more creative, to be willing to take risks and put myself out there. I lived a very conservative lifestyle up until there. So I guess we could say that the Renaissance Fair ruined me in some ways.
Oh, no.
But I always have that to look back on. I can look at what I've achieved. So, why can't I achieve more now in my career?
Yeah.
My greatest achievement, it was my time at fair.
Yeah.
And I will probably never be able to duplicate it. I don't know that I will ever have the opportunity to do something like that again. But it was, and I hate that while cell phone technology was growing all that time, there is little record of any of it, which is,
yeah.
And I think it goes back to what you were saying, the value of these conversations you're having is that the history of what we did just exists in the minds of the people who are still around, really.
Right. Right. So for the listeners, that the dream that was fulfilled was at the St. Louis Renaissance Festival was in your role as a creative director, where you worked with creating, directing the show as far as the scenario, the recruitment of cast, with the theme and the direction of how everything flowed throughout the day, from the morning meeting to the jousts, even to the parade that we used to have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And even with the engagement of the merchants and some of the stage acts, because there was a time where the scenario, that story may have had an element that could be drawn out by some of the stage acts.
Absolutely.
Or just the recognition or the acknowledgement of, hey, here's this thing going on. And having been a part of your tenure there, I don't know if I could handle the level of some of what we were doing. Some of those scripts were, I still have them.
Really?
Yeah. Put away in one of my tubs, actually, or probably in my closet with all my other fair stuff, to look back on some of those scripts. And I think to myself, how did I do all that? Having done this recent show, and there weren't a whole lot of lines. So, there were enough. I was like, I haven't had to memorize lines in a long time. But to look back at some of those shows, they were intense. There was a lot going on. But at the same time, it did drive everything that we were doing.
Right.
From the beginning of the day to the end of the day and everything in between. In a lot of ways, it also drove what we were doing potentially, or interacting with merchants or artisans, with the jousts. My fondest memory, and I want to say it's probably 2008, or I think it's 2008, when we had the year of when Charles Bourbon was arrested. And we had the culminating scene, if you will, I believe, save for what happened. I don't even remember what we did for the end of the day as far as the closing, if anything of any substance. But that big scene was the fight scene that took place on the joust field before that final joust.
Mm-hmm.
There are times now I wish we had then the audience that we do now around that field. It was such a spectacular thing because it was intense. This relationship that Charles Bourbon and Francois I had. And what I loved about it was the script that was created for that scene and the sword fight that was worked into it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably a little biased about that experience, but it's one of the most fluid and sound fights or sword encounters that I ever really remember experiencing.
Really?
And I think primarily because of the script that drove, one, it was the lead up,
mm-hmm.
and it was the script that drove that fight.
Right.
And had it just been a pure choreographed fight with all of the, even just using the basic moves for positions, it would not have been the same thing. And that script allowed for this momentum, this movement through that scene, and that the fight that took place. In my mind, I think that is something that could really benefit any fight, if you will, especially in any staged fight or that kind of an interaction in a Renaissance festival. I mean, maybe even a Pirate Fest or whatever.
Sure.
It's not a boxing match, but to just stand there and watch, even honestly, even just watching two boxers go at it isn't necessarily going to be all that exciting. I mean, I guess it could be, but without that commentary to go along with it, it just completely changes the nature of what it is. And so many of the scripts, I mean, we had that driving force from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. And sure, there were a couple of years in there where I was like, this is nuts. This is crazy. I can't believe that we were doing what? But to look back on it, the storylines were engaging.
Right.
A second was the Romeo and Ethel, the pirate's daughter.
Right.
You, as a creative director, you were flexible, but you were also direct. You had a vision. You wanted something. And the Pirate Fest of 2011 was that. You allowed people to make the characters their own. Even though we are, or some of us who were historical figures, whether or not they would have actually done that. And that's
sure. I really appreciate what you say, and it makes me feel sad that we never had conversations like this back when it was going on.
Right. No, I know.
I would have loved to hear that from you at the time. I take my inspiration as far as directing goes from Robert Altman. Directed the movie MASH, not the TV series, but the movie MASH, quite a few films. And what Robert Altman was good at was bringing people into a room and allowing them to establish the relationships between each other.
Mm-hmm.
And very much like, I guess what you're saying is allowing, because it's easy to write, okay, here's your motivations, this is what you're doing. But I want the character to be real to the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And for it to be real to the audience, it's got to be real to the actor. And so you give the actor room to express what they think, how they feel, and you give them room to bring that together. And when you're talking about a big ensemble cast like what we had at the Renaissance Fair, like that's really the only way to do it. I could come in and tell you, do this at this time and this at the other time. One, my thought is you're not going to have any fun doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And two, if I give you direction, if I say, this is where I want us to end up, this is where we start and here's where we end up. These are the things that happen along the way, but how do you feel like it goes? If I give you that room, it becomes more real to you as the performer.
Mm-hmm.
Then it becomes more entertaining to the audience, or at least that's my theory. It was, to me, the only way to work, again, with a big cast like ours. So I appreciate it. I tried, honestly, when I wrote the scripts, I always thought about who was saying the lines.
Right.
And it was fun for me, for example, to put you in certain positions. One of my favorite scenes, it was you and your mother, King Francois and his mother, and she's nitpicking at you. And the audience could see, because you would, when she turned her back and they could see the consternation, the frustration, the, oh my God, she's doing it again, pouring off of you. And it was so entertaining. The audience loved it.
Yeah.
But see, you're going to draw that out easier than for me to sit down and try to paint it on you.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, to me, and I'll be honest, I mean, everybody complained about scenario, and I mean, we all did.
Yeah.
Even when I wrote it. But I really felt like, and this is the way I looked at it, whether we were doing Pirate Fest or the Renaissance Fair, the fair was an organism.
Mm-hmm.
And that included everybody involved. Everybody was a part of that organism. Everybody had a role to play, and everybody was important. It didn't matter if they were a front gate greeter, somebody working at a booth, a merchant, a lane performer, the king. You were all a part of the show. Scenario to me was, if it was properly written, what kept the organism together.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we all bought into it, if we all could say, yeah, we're going to do this, then the organism was healthy and it had life. It brought that out more. I've been to a few fairs and they don't have a scenario, or if they do, it's not very all-encompassing.
Mm-hmm.
And it often feels to me that like it's not an organism. It's not. It feels often like it's a lot of things going on in different places, but there's nothing to tie things together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and I could be proven wrong, but I think that the audience has a better opportunity to get that entertainment, to see a fair experience as more than a historical shopping mall. I don't know.
No, I get it.
Something like that, tying it together. If we all have a purpose that we can agree on, then we can also look back and see, hey, we made this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there were a lot of those years where we had that component. And then when you don't have a scenario, you just have royalty, you have nobles, you have peasants, you have visitors, the merchant class from different cultures or whatever. And then you have the artisans. So you have that craft artisan component as far as going into watching demonstrations of things being made and even being able to purchase things being made. And that was very much a part of the conversation I had earlier this afternoon with Malgar from Thorvik Crafts, that they are part of that bigger picture, and to remember that. And even if you weren't to have a scenario, it's the comment you made about buying in to what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That scenario helps big time, even if it's a simple thing. But there's that commonality, like with looking at this upcoming season for the St. Louis Renaissance Festival. For all my listeners, that comes up a lot because that's where I had my start and am still very much involved with. And I would imagine it's a similar thing with pretty much any Renaissance festival. Scenario, no scenario, new cast, old cast, long-standing directors, new directors, whatever the case may be. A lot of this is a part of that organism, etc. So anyway, with the scenario that we have, we brought back a more substantial scenario-ish, not as heavily scripted, but we wanted a driving storyline. And because this year is the 25th anniversary, with those kinds of celebrations, that's a driving force. It's a big deal for festivals. The Southern California Pleasure Fair, based on the research that I've done and the reading that I've done, etc., they are the inaugural Renaissance festival.
Yes.
Like, they're it. They began this.
They're the first, yes.
Thing. And that was back in 62, 63. And they're still around and going strong.
Yeah.
And so if you're looking at 63, that's 60 years.
I still have a number of friends who work there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
To have that kind of history is, something to build on. It makes me think to look back to some of those scripts, to go back to some of those storylines. What were some of the things that we did? And maybe there's in a way of celebrating, even though with some of those scenarios having taken place well in the future, because those first couple of years of when Francois, the first 3 years of the St. Louis Fair, it was Francois, but it was the 1530s. Right. And then when we jumped into the late 1540s, 1550s with Henri II, and then back into the 1520s with Francois, But even still, some of those events that took place, they're part of the story. They're part of the fabric of a Renaissance festival, and not just St. Louis. All of the festivals have that if they have a scenario, and honestly, even if they don't.
I'd like to hope so.
Right. Right. And with St. Louis in particular, celebrating the 25th anniversary, the way we're playing it, it makes me think about how can we bring in the guest acts, the merchants, the jousters, for everyone to buy in, because it's a big deal in a lot of ways. And ultimately, because Renaissance festivals are really seen as these big celebrations, I mean, even of the Renaissance, like, oh my gosh, the royal family is coming to our village.
Oh, yes.
It's a massive, massive thing. And it may have been a once in a lifetime thing for a young peasant who works on a farm every day, or serf or merchant who's out on the docks or working in a shop all the time, but never leaves the town or the village or whatever. Honestly, even in the larger cities.
That is the first thing you learn working at a booth at the Southern California Fair is, okay, here's the setting. There's this fair is gathered up because the king, the queen, the whoever, as Queen Elizabeth usually, is here. She's coming through once in a lifetime, everything you're saying.
Yeah.
And that is the first thing you learn. And that is the one thing you know. You can count on every booth person who, okay, so there's different levels, right? And booths are often looked at least in Southern California Fair, they were often looked at as like kind of the lowest form of life, I guess. But that was the one thing everybody had.
Yeah.
Was that Queen Elizabeth was here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I get it. I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah. And to have that driving force, and it is that buy-in, that it's something that we spent the time to spend the time on the reverencing those class differences. And even as patrons, once upon a time, and I don't know necessarily with some fairs, because I've been to other festivals, have been blown away by the sheer volume of people.
Yeah.
And the size of those festivals, just the area in which they encompass is huge. And for performers, there's no way they're moving through all of that in a timely fashion. And unless some grandiose thing is made of it. And it's become that way with the St. Louis Renaissance Festival. Unless we have a substantial presence of royalty, it's not just a couple of us, you can't move through the festival grounds in the same way. Because people aren't you have to make it massive in order for people to know that what's going on. One person, if I were to be walking around even with a guard, it's still not as effective.
Right.
Because it's just me, or if one of the queens or one of the other nobles, even if they had a guard, they're just walking around.
Right.
That audience. Whereas when you have the opportunity to have a larger presence, but what helps in that buy-in is that everyone, and I mean everyone, buys in because of the show.
Yes.
The performance. And I joke a lot. And I did this past week at rehearsal because we posed a question to the cast and gave them some homework. We want to know the next time that we meet for rehearsal, we want to know, why do you do this? Why are you here? And I jokingly said, well, after 24 years, primary reason why I do this is because I get to have people bow to me all the time. That's what keeps me coming back every year, is to have all these people bow to me. That doesn't happen as much as it used to. So it's not but I jokingly say that, but it's part of the show.
Right.
For those kids. And it's that can be a hard sell for some people. And in today's day and time, you want that. There's, and has been for a long time, the equality aspect, and from diversity, equality, you name it. But back then, you had your royalty You had your nobility, you had your merchant class, you had your peasant class, you had the beggars, you had the travelers, you had your soldiers, you had your military. And there were distinctive ways of interacting between those, if at all.
Yes.
And that's something that I think with the writing that you had done, working to create that organism, it helped also to remove that class separation, if you will, even though it was recognized, even though we did the reverencing, everything else. But at the same time, we also wanted to make sure that everybody was still approachable.
Right.
Yes, the king and queen are way up here. But at the same time, anybody else on cast, any of the other merchants, any of the other artisans, the performers, the patrons who that's why we're there, they can approach us. They still want that awe. That's a big part of it, is to experience that. Oh my gosh, these are the celebrities of the day. To see nowadays, to go to an event where you're going to see Tom Hanks or Charlize Theron and whoever, those are the only people I can come up with off the top of my head for some reason, but you're not just going to walk up to them.
Right.
You probably could, but I don't know how easily that would happen.
Depending on the situation, with
right.
bodyguards or not. Well, and that's the thing. There's a way to have the reverence, to display the class separation, but also have the interaction, again, for the good of the show.
Right.
When your cast buys into it, it just makes it that easier.
Yeah. And I think that was one of the things you did well in guiding the cast in particular, but that was held together was that buy-in, because I really think the majority of us, we bought into that, and it came off in the experience that the patrons had. There's still some of that reverential element, but there's also a humanness to those people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, when you have this big celebration, when you bring in all the performers, and I've seen this at several festivals where you have the stage acts, you have the royalty, you have et cetera, to achieve that. And you're sending the patrons out with this wonderful experience that brings them back. And you have the opportunity to engage with them.
The thing that I grew to love to do more than anything was at the end of the day, and I started doing it just because I didn't have anything else to do, and it kind of took on a life of its own for a little while, was I would just sit up toward at the exit gate and sing as people left, and just say goodbye to them, ask them what they enjoyed, ask them what their favorite memory was.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were doing well, I felt very much like you could see it on their faces.
Yes.
We gave them an experience that they didn't expect. It was more than they expected, and that they would be back, that we were able to let them touch something that was special.
Right.
And I still say it. It was because of the contributions of everyone that we did that.
Mm-hmm.
It was because everyone was a part of the show.
Right.
Regardless of their job or their station or their duties, everyone was valued.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone was listened to, and everyone mattered.
Yeah.
I used to tell patrons, I'd say, you must come back again. It just won't be the same without you.
Mm.
Okay, well, it will be very similar, but not the same. And it's true. It's the same thing with the cast. Okay, absolutely. You could have somebody miss or not be or not feel right one day, and the show is still going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not to take away the energy and the love and the contributions and the time somebody put into to make their part of it, no matter how big or small it was, worthwhile.
Right.
Worth being seen.
Yeah.
And my philosophy always was take care of the cast, and the cast will take care of the patrons.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never had anybody tell me that wasn't what we were doing.
Agreed. When I first joined the cast, one, I had no idea really what I was getting myself into, because I had attended KC's fair, performed. I say performed. I was part of a collegiate ensemble that performed in Kansas City in the fall of '96. And that was a jaw-dropping experience, because I'm walking into my most favorite time in history.
Yeah.
And to have walked around and to even performed as part of that, and then to peruse everything that was going on, and then to go back the next year just as a patron. And then to find out that there's this one that's starting up in St. Louis, going the first year because I knew a couple people on the cast, and then joining the next year. At the time, I didn't do it for the patrons. I did it because it's like, this is like, I'm really interested in this. But as you learn very quickly, the way we were taught or the direction and everything that we were given, it wasn't about us. Everything that we did was about the patrons, about those people who were walking through the gates because they wanted to put the real world aside for a morning, for an afternoon, for a day, for a weekend. And any of the other stuff that was happening had no business being seen by the patrons. As a note, one of the personal benefits of this podcast has been so far, and the conversations I've had, is it's reminded me about the importance of what we do as performers, as artisans, as entertainers, you name it, as the person standing at the front gate. We are adding value to the lives of other people who might desperately need it. Or maybe they don't need it, but they're going to get it anyway because, well, they've walked through those gates. And this is an experience that you may or may not have had before, but welcome. Taking that mentality and internalizing it and then letting it just basically explode over everything that happens. And to sit and think that way, because having been doing this for 24 years and having been the French king since 2002, consecutively since 2004, because I took 2003 when my daughter was born.
Right.
But I was still there, but not there.
Yeah.
I needed to hear these stories, to talk about this stuff. I've talked with people before about, who are part of casts and everything else, but to talk to people who've been doing this longer, who had their start, came from somewhere else. It's that chord that you mentioned earlier that vibrates when Renaissance Festival comes to town. For me personally, that chord hasn't been vibrating very much, or it's been kind of a slow go.
I understand that one.
And it's come up multiple times in conversations just about the significance of what this world is. It's a very unique world. It's a world that, yes, has its ups and downs. And it has its, I'm not going to say secrets. It has its dark side of things. Mm-hmm. It has its history. Things have happened, but that happens everywhere. Right? It doesn't make any difference where. It happens everywhere, unfortunately. And that's kind of the brokenness of the world. But the opportunities, the community, the welcoming nature of the people, and remembering that. You stated that everyone plays a part, no matter how big or how small. As someone who's portrayed the King of France for over 20 years, my role, sure, that's a big character. And there are some days when I go, I don't know how I ended up in this role. I still, to this day, am not 100% sure, because I'm not as gregarious as my predecessor was. And I'm not I wasn't necessarily as big of a character, if you will.
Yeah, but I think we can say you've made this role your own. Please go on.
Oh, yeah. My role and the significance of being the king means very little unless you have someone who's playing a character that in stature or class is lower, but it's how they respond, how they interact with that other character, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. That makes it big. For me to not interact with someone who's a beggar, or like the travelers, they grovel. They're looked at as kind of this hodgepodge group of people who you're not 100% sure where they came from in their travels and what their background is, potentially sketchy or
rebels, liars.
Yeah. But if I dismiss what their characters are about, that comes off. So it helps the understanding of what my character is based on how I react and vice versa.
And you should be given credit for it, Ted. Your portrayal, at least for as long as I've known you, mm-hmm. has always been that. While you can, on one hand, affect the grandeur and the stature, the gravitas, if you will, of the King of France, you also are able to, how do I want to say it? Because you don't humble yourself to get on their level.
I do hope you enjoyed this episode and the first portion of my conversation with my guest, Douglas Carr. As I have left you with a bit of a cliffhanger, be sure to tune in for the next installment of Coffee Talk with King Francois I to hear the remainder of our conversation. That said, be on the lookout for the next installment of Coffee Talk with King Francois I. If you are a performer, artisan, merchant, staff, or diehard patron in or of the Renaissance Festival world and would like to be featured on Coffee Talk with King Francois I, reach out to me by way of clicking on the following link provided in the show notes: www.theodorejander.com/Coffee Talk Podcast. Would you like to receive early access to each new episode, as well as receive a behind-the-scenes glimpse into the production and creative process for the podcast? If so, join the wonderful community of listeners supporting the show and making new things possible through Patreon. Learn more at www.patreon.com/Coffee Talk with King Francois. Thank you so much for tuning in to Coffee Talk with King Francois I. A bientôt. See you soon. Ciao for now and au revoir.